The evening sun was setting over the city skyline as a seasoned federal prosecutor wrapped up another long day at the U.S. Attorney's office. He had just finished preparing for a major case that would begin next week, and his mind was already running through the opening statements he carefully crafted. The clock on his dashboard read 7:45 p.m. as he drove his black sedan through the familiar streets of his neighborhood. The day had been particularly satisfying. He'd helped secure an important indictment in a human trafficking case, and his team's hard work over the past 6 months was finally paying off. As he stopped at a red light, he loosened his tie slightly and thought about the dinner waiting for him at home. His wife had texted earlier about making his favorite pasta dish. The streets were quiet, with only a few cars sharing the road. In his rearview mirror, he noticed a police cruiser that had been following him for the past few blocks. He didn't think much of it at first. After all, he'd been driving exactly at the speed limit, and his car documents were all in order. But something felt off about the way the patrol car kept maintaining the same distance behind him. Just as he turned onto Oak Avenue, the red and blue lights began flashing in his mirror. His heart sank a little, not from guilt, but from experience. As a federal prosecutor, he'd seen enough cases to know that sometimes traffic stops weren't just about traffic violations. He pulled over carefully, positioning his car well out of the traffic's way, and followed all the proper procedures he'd advised countless others to follow. He turned off the engine, placed his hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and waited. Through his side mirror, he watched the officer approach, noting how the officer's hand was already resting on his holster, a detail that didn't escape his trained eye. He'd prosecuted enough cases to know this wasn't standard procedure for a routine traffic stop. Officer Peterson, badge #4578, approached with heavy footsteps, his flashlight beam sweeping across the car's interior despite the street being well lit. "License and registration," he barked, without the customary greeting or explanation for the stop. The prosecutor kept his movements slow and deliberate, narrating each action. "Officer, I'm reaching for my wallet in my right jacket pocket, and then I'll get my registration from the glove compartment." The officer's response was immediate and hostile. "Just hurry up and don't try anything funny." The prosecutor could feel his legal training kicking in, mentally documenting every word and action. He'd stood in courtrooms defending the actions of good police officers, but he'd also prosecuted those who abused their authority. Right now, his instincts told him this encounter was headed in a troubling direction. As he handed over his credentials, including his federal prosecutor's ID, he noticed the officer barely glanced at them. Instead, Peterson's attention seemed fixed on something else, the color of his skin. The prosecutor had experienced this before, but never quite this blatantly, and never while carrying federal credentials. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer commanded, his tone suggesting this wasn't a routine traffic stop anymore. The prosecutor knew his rights, but he also knew that in this moment he needed to be extremely careful. Years of experience in the justice system had taught him that what happened in the next few minutes could change, or end, a life. "May I ask why I'm being asked to exit the vehicle, officer?" he inquired calmly, his voice steady and professional. The response he received would later become a crucial piece of evidence. "Because you match the description of someone we're looking for. And all you people always have something to hide." In that moment, the prosecutor realized this wasn't just going to be a simple traffic stop. It was about to become a test case for everything he'd spent his career fighting for, equal justice under the law. As he carefully followed the officer's instructions, his mind was already cataloging every detail, every word, every procedural violation. Little did Officer Peterson know, he had just pulled over the wrong person, or perhaps exactly the right person to expose what needed to be exposed. Standing under the harsh glare of streetlights, the federal prosecutor maintained his composure as Officer Peterson circled him like a predator sizing up its prey. The night air had grown chilly, but that wasn't the reason for the slight tremor in his hands. 20 years of legal experience told him that this situation was rapidly spiraling in a dangerous direction. "Where were you coming from?" Officer Peterson demanded, his flashlight beam unnecessarily bright in the prosecutor's eyes. "I'm returning home from my office at the U.S. Attorney's office downtown," he replied calmly, squinting against the light. "I'm a federal prosecutor, as my credentials show." The officer's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Right, and I'm the Attorney General. He waved the federal credentials in the air as if they were a child's drawing. You know how many fake IDs we see every week? These look pretty good though, I'll give you that. The prosecutor took a slow, measured breath. He'd stood before the Supreme Court, handled multi-million-dollar cases, and put away some of the country's most dangerous criminals. Yet here he was, being treated like a common criminal by an officer who refused to even properly look at his identification. "Officer, if you'll just call the federal courthouse or check my bar number," he began, but Peterson cut him off. "Here's what we're going to do," the officer announced, tucking the credentials into his pocket rather than returning them. 3 robberies in this area last week. Suspect description: black male, business attire, driving a dark sedan. He gestured at the prosecutor's car. Ring any bells? The absurdity of the situation would have been almost comical if it weren't so dangerous. The prosecutor had actually been briefed on those robberies earlier that week. They weren't even in his jurisdiction, but crossed over with a federal case his office was handling. The suspect they were looking for was at least 20 years younger and significantly shorter than him. "Officer, those robberies were committed by someone half my age. The suspect description includes a height of 5'7". I'm 6'2". If you'll just verify my identity." "Oh, you know the details of the robberies pretty well, don't you?" Peterson interrupted, his voice taking on a triumphant tone. Wonder how that could be. The prosecutor felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd seen this scenario play out countless times in case files that crossed his desk, where every word, every action by the suspect was twisted to fit a predetermined narrative. Only now, he wasn't reading about it. He was living it. "I know about the robberies because I'm a federal prosecutor," he explained again, his voice steady despite his growing frustration. "The case file crossed my desk because there might be federal implications. If you'll just call." "Hands behind your back," Peterson ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent." As the cold metal closed around his wrists, the prosecutor couldn't help but think about all the times he'd stood in court, assuring judges and juries that the system worked, that proper procedures were followed, that officers could be trusted to use their discretion fairly. Now, with his own credentials sitting ignored in Peterson's pocket, those arguments felt hollow. Other officers began arriving on scene, their patrol cars adding to the circus of flashing lights. None of them bothered to verify his identity either. Instead, they stood around, some looking uncomfortable, others completely indifferent, as Peterson continued his investigation. "Found something interesting," Peterson announced, emerging from the prosecutor's car where he'd been searching without consent. He held up a leather-bound folder. "Court documents, lots of them, probably stolen." The prosecutor closed his eyes briefly. Those were his notes for next week's human trafficking case, confidential documents that Peterson was now thumbing through without any legal right to do so. "Those are federal case files," he said firmly. "You're potentially compromising an ongoing investigation. This is your last chance to call the U.S. Attorney's Office and verify my identity." But Peterson wasn't listening anymore. He was too invested in his narrative, too convinced of his own righteousness. As the prosecutor was led to the patrol car, he caught fragments of Peterson's conversation with another officer. "Perfect timing. Was about to end my shift. Bigger bust than those robberies." Sitting in the back of the patrol car, the prosecutor began mentally preparing for what would come next. He knew the system intimately, both its strengths and its flaws. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, he focused on remembering every detail of this encounter. Because someday soon, Officer Peterson would learn exactly who he had arrested, and this night would become much more than just another false arrest based on racial profiling. It would become a turning point. The ride to the police station felt longer than it should have. Each street light that passed overhead cast alternating shadows across the prosecutor's face as he sat silently in the back of the patrol car. He'd made this same journey countless times before, but always in the front seat, always as a respected member of the justice system. Tonight was different. Officer Peterson was on his radio, already congratulating himself on what he thought was a major arrest. "Got him," he boasted to dispatch. "That robbery suspect we've been after. Found him with stolen court documents and everything." The prosecutor noted how the officer conveniently left out any mention of the federal credentials he'd confiscated. Through the metal grating separating the front and back seats, the prosecutor watched the city pass by. He thought about his wife, who would be wondering why he wasn't home yet. He thought about his morning court appearance that might now be delayed. But mostly, he thought about every person who'd ever sat where he was sitting now, victims of prejudice who didn't have his resources or knowledge of the system. At the station, Peterson made a show of parading him through the booking area. "Big catch tonight," he announced to his colleagues, some of whom looked up with mild interest. The prosecutor recognized several faces, officers he'd worked with on federal cases, though none seemed to recognize him in this context. It was amazing how a pair of handcuffs could make someone invisible. During booking, he remained silent but observant. Every procedural violation, every skipped step, every assumption made, he catalogued them all in his mind. When they took his fingerprints, he noticed how the booking officer didn't even bother to check them against the federal database, which would have immediately identified him as a Justice Department employee. "Empty your pockets," the booking officer instructed. The prosecutor would have complied, but Peterson had already taken everything during the unlawful search of his person, including his phone, wallet, and those federal credentials that nobody had bothered to verify. "My belongings were already confiscated during an unauthorized search at the scene," he stated calmly, "including my federal prosecutor's badge and credentials, which I once again request that you verify." The booking officer looked to Peterson, who shrugged. "Claims he's some big-shot federal prosecutor. Yeah, right. Probably stole those credentials along with the court documents we found in his car." As they led him toward the holding cells, the prosecutor noticed a familiar face. A young public defender he'd faced in court just last week. Their eyes met briefly, and he saw the moment of recognition cross the defender's face, followed by confusion and concern. Good. At least someone in the building knew something wasn't right. "One phone call," the prosecutor said firmly when they reached the phone area. It wasn't a request. Even Peterson seemed to understand he couldn't deny this basic right. Alone for the first time since this ordeal began, the prosecutor picked up the phone. He could have called any number of people, his supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's office, the district attorney, even the police chief. All would have ended this situation immediately. But he had a different plan. Instead, he dialed his colleague in the Civil Rights Division, the one who'd been building a case about systemic discrimination in traffic stops. As the phone rang, he glanced at Peterson, who was watching him suspiciously through the glass partition. "Hey, it's me," he said when his colleague answered. "Remember that pattern of incidents we discussed last month? I'm about to give you your smoking gun. Bring a team to central booking first thing in the morning. And whatever you do, don't let anyone know who I am until court." He could have ended this nightmare with a single phone call to the right person, but sometimes, he reminded himself, the path to real change requires personal sacrifice. Tonight, he would be just another statistic in their system. But tomorrow would be different. As they led him to his cell, he heard Peterson talking to another officer, probably calling his accomplices. "We'll check the number later." The prosecutor allowed himself a small smile. Let them check. Let them follow every wrong assumption to its logical conclusion. The bigger the hole they dug tonight, the more impact tomorrow's revelation would have. The cell door clanged shut behind him, and he sat down on the hard bench. In his mind, he was already composing the civil rights complaint this incident would generate. But more importantly, he was thinking about how to use this experience to create lasting change. Sometimes, he reflected, the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't a law book or a court order, it's the truth, revealed at precisely the right moment. The holding cell was exactly what you'd expect: cold concrete walls, a metal bench that served as both seat and bed, and a small window too high to see through. The federal prosecutor sat quietly, his back straight despite his exhaustion, watching the small drama of night court play out in the cell block around him. Two drunk college students in the cell across from him were loudly proclaiming their innocence. An elderly man who'd been arrested for sleeping in the park was humming softly to himself. A teenager picked up for shoplifting kept asking when his mother was coming. The prosecutor had seen thousands of cases cross his desk over the years, but being on this side of the system gave him a whole new perspective. Every hour, a different officer would walk by on their rounds. Some ignored the cells completely, others peered in with varying degrees of interest or disdain. A few seemed uncomfortable when they recognized him from federal court, quickly averting their eyes and hurrying past. None of them raised any questions about why a federal prosecutor was sitting in a holding cell. Around midnight, a young officer, probably new to the job, brought him a paper cup of water. "Sir," the officer whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder, "I think I recognize you from the courthouse. Should I make a call?" The prosecutor shook his head slightly. "Thank you, but no. Sometimes the system needs to play itself out." The young officer nodded uncertainly and moved on, but the brief interaction gave the prosecutor hope. Not everyone in the department was willing to turn a blind eye to injustice. As the night wore on, he could hear Officer Peterson in the distance, still filing paperwork, still bragging about his big arrest. The officer had no idea he was actually documenting his own misconduct with every report he filed, every procedure he ignored, every assumption he recorded as fact. The prosecutor used the time to think, to plan, to remember. He thought about the young man he'd helped exonerate last month, wrongfully convicted based on similar profiling. He remembered the look of disbelief on that man's face when the judge had finally said, "Case dismissed." Tomorrow, he would make sure Officer Peterson understood that same feeling of having the ground shift beneath his feet. Around 2 a.m., the drunk college students were released to their parents. One of them actually apologized to the officers for being such a pain. The prosecutor noticed how differently they were treated, with eye rolls and head shakes rather than suspicion and hostility. Their IDs hadn't been questioned. Their story had been believed without verification. He pulled out a loose thread from his suit jacket and began using it to write notes on his paper water cup, times, names, badge numbers, violations of procedure. His handwriting was tiny but precise. This cup would never make it into evidence, but the act of documenting helped him organize his thoughts, plan his strategy for the morning. The elderly man from the park was released around 3 a.m. with directions to a nearby shelter. The teenager's mother finally arrived, tired and angry, but more at the system than at her son. The prosecutor watched their interactions with the officers, noting the subtle and not-so-subtle differences in treatment. As dawn approached, the cell block grew quieter. The prosecutor hadn't slept, but he didn't feel tired. 20 years of preparing for big cases had taught him how to stay alert when it mattered. And tomorrow would matter more than most days in his career. He heard the shift change happening, officers leaving, new ones arriving. Peterson's voice had finally gone home, but not before filing what the prosecutor knew would be a very interesting arrest report. Every exaggeration, every misrepresentation in that report would soon become evidence. Through the high window, he could see the sky beginning to lighten. Soon, the morning shift would begin processing people for court. His colleague from the Civil Rights Division would be arriving at the courthouse. The young public defender who'd recognize him would probably be making some calls. The prosecutor smiled slightly, remembering a quote from his favorite law school professor, "Justice doesn't always wear a suit and sit behind a desk. Sometimes it has to put on handcuffs and sit in a cell to remind us why we need it." A new officer appeared, clipboard in hand. "Processing for morning court starts in 30 minutes, he announced to the cell block. The prosecutor stood up, straightened his wrinkled suit as best he could, and took a deep breath. In a few hours, Officer Peterson would learn an important lesson about prejudice, procedure, and the true meaning of justice. And this time, the lesson would stick. The morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows as Officer Peterson strode confidently into the building. He'd arrived early, eager to see his big arrest processed through the system. The overnight holding cell supervisor had already prepared the morning's case files, and Peterson had made sure his arrest was at the top of the stack. "Moin, Your Honor," Peterson said cheerfully to Judge Williams as he entered the courtroom. The judge, a veteran of 30 years on the bench, merely nodded while reviewing her morning docket. The courtroom was beginning to fill with the usual morning crowd: public defenders, prosecutors, court officers, and families of the accused. The district attorney walked in, coffee in hand, barely glancing at the files. These morning arraignments were usually routine. A steady stream of minor offenses, bond settings, and plea arrangements. Also, everyone thought this morning would be. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff called the court to order. "All rise. Criminal Court Part A is now in session, the Honorable Judge Williams presiding." The familiar ritual of morning court began, but there was an unusual energy in the air that even Peterson could sense. The first few cases moved quickly. A drunk driving arrest, a shoplifting charge, and minor drug possession. Then the bailiff called out, State versus John Doe, arrested yesterday evening, charged with possession of stolen documents and impersonating a federal officer. Peterson sat up straighter, eager to see his arrest processed. The door from the holding area opened, and a prosecutor walked in, still wearing his wrinkled suit from the day before. But something was different. The court officers weren't leading him to the defendant's table. Judge Williams looked up from her papers, her eyes widening slightly. "Counselor," she said, "I wasn't expecting to see you this morning. Don't you have that trafficking case in federal court?" "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied calmly. "However, I find myself in an unusual position this morning." He turned slightly, making eye contact with Officer Peterson. "I'm here regarding last night's arrest." The district attorney, who had been sipping his coffee, suddenly froze. He looked from the prosecutor to Peterson, then back again. The color drained from his face as realization dawned. "Your Honor," the district attorney started, rising quickly. "There seems to be a serious mistake." "Indeed there is," the prosecutor agreed. "Officer Peterson arrested me last night, claiming I was impersonating myself." He reached into his wrinkled suit jacket and pulled out his federal credentials, not the ones Peterson had confiscated, but his backup set from his office. "I am, as I repeatedly informed Officer Peterson, a federal prosecutor. These are my genuine credentials, which can be easily verified." The courtroom had gone completely silent. Peterson's confident smile had vanished, replaced by a look of growing horror. The young public defender from the night before was trying hard to suppress a smile. "Furthermore," the prosecutor continued, his voice steady and clear, "Officer Peterson currently has in his possession my original credentials, which he refused to verify. He also has confidential federal case files that he seized from my car without cause or warrant, potentially compromising an ongoing human trafficking investigation." Judge Williams removed her glasses slowly, fixing Peterson with a stern look. Officer Peterson approached the bench. Peterson's footsteps echoed in the silent courtroom as he walked forward. His face had taken on a sickly pale color, and sweat was visible on his forehead. "Officer," the judge said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "are you telling me you arrested a federal prosecutor on his way home from work, ignored his credentials, seized federal documents, and held him overnight without ever once verifying his identity?" I thought," Peterson stammered. "You thought what, exactly?" the judge pressed. Before Peterson could answer, the courtroom doors opened. A team of officials in suits entered, the prosecutor's colleagues from the Civil Rights Division, right on schedule. They took seats in the gallery, notepads ready. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "I'd like to enter into the record every procedural violation, every ignored request for identification verification, and every indication of bias that occurred during my arrest and detention. And I'd like to note that my experience is not unique. It's just that most victims of this type of profiling don't have the ability to prove it so conclusively." Judge Williams nodded gravely. "I believe, Officer Peterson, that you're about to learn a very expensive lesson about making assumptions." She turned to the prosecutor. "Counselor, I assume you'll be filing charges." "Not charges, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied, straightening his tie. "Something more important. A complete review of every arrest Officer Peterson has made in the past 5 years, and a department-wide audit of traffic stop procedures." He glanced at his colleagues from the Civil Rights Division. "We believe this incident is indicative of a pattern that needs to be addressed." The morning sun had now fully illuminated the courtroom, and with it, Officer Peterson's world had been turned upside down. As he stood there, facing the consequences of his actions, the prosecutor's words hung in the air. A promise that this case would reach far beyond one wrong arrest on one dark night. The investigation that followed the courtroom revelation shook the police department to its core. Within hours of the prosecutor's dramatic appearance in court, the Internal Affairs Office had been transformed into a command center. Boxes of case files lined the walls, each containing traffic stops and arrests made by Officer Peterson over the past 5 years. The prosecutor's civil rights team worked methodically, their task force taking over a conference room on the 3rd floor. They had been preparing for something like this for months, but none of them had expected such a perfect case to land in their laps, or that it would involve one of their own. "Look at this pattern," one investigator said, pointing to a wall of data they'd compiled. 87% of Peterson's traffic stops involved minority drivers. But the neighborhood demographics don't support those numbers, not even close. The prosecutor's wrongful arrest had opened a floodgate. As news of the incident spread, more people came forward with their own stories. A local business owner described being stopped 3 times in 1 month. A medical student shared dashcam footage of a similar encounter. A retired teacher brought in detailed notes she'd kept of 6 unnecessary stops over 2 years. Body camera footage told an even more damaging story. The team discovered that Peterson often muted his microphone during key parts of stops, a direct violation of department policy. His written reports frequently contradicted what the videos showed. The more they dug, the more problems they found. "We've got something interesting here," called out one of the analysts, waving a stack of papers. "Remember that string of robberies Peterson claimed he was investigating when he made the arrest? The actual suspect description didn't match at all, different height, age, even the car description was wrong. He completely fabricated the connection." The police chief, who had initially tried to minimize the incident, now sat in stunned silence as the evidence mounted. His department's reputation was on the line, and he knew it. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. This was about systemic failures in training, supervision, and accountability. The investigation expanded beyond Peterson. Other officers' records were pulled for comparison. Patterns emerged showing how implicit bias had influenced policing across the entire department. Some officers, when shown the data, were genuinely shocked by their own statistics. "I had no idea," one veteran officer admitted during an interview. "You do this job long enough, you start operating on autopilot. Maybe we all need to take a hard look at how we're making these decisions." The prosecutor's colleagues interviewed dispatchers, reviewed radio logs, and analyzed computer terminal searches. They found that Peterson had never actually run the prosecutor's credentials through the system. If he had, the truth would have been immediately clear. Instead, he had simply assumed they were fake, fitting the facts to his preconceptions. Dashboard camera footage from the night of the arrest proved particularly damning. It showed Peterson following the prosecutor's car for several blocks before finding a reason to pull him over. The audio captured comments that made his bias obvious, comments that would soon become evidence in a much larger case. The investigation also revealed something unexpected: a pattern of complaints that had been filed but never properly addressed. They had been buried under paperwork, marked as resolved, without real investigation, or simply ignored. Each one represented a missed opportunity to address the problem before it escalated. Local community leaders were invited to review the findings. Many of them had been raising concerns about biased policing for years, but their voices had often been dismissed. Now, with hard evidence in hand, they finally had proof of what they'd known all along. "This isn't about punishing one officer," the prosecutor explained during a briefing with department leadership. "This is about fixing a broken system. We need to ensure this never happens to anyone else, badge or no badge." The investigation's scope continued to grow. Training procedures were scrutinized. Supervisory protocols were examined. Even the department's hiring practices came under review. What had started with one wrongful arrest was becoming a comprehensive examination of modern policing. Peterson, meanwhile, had been placed on administrative leave. His union representative advised him to cooperate fully with the investigation, seeing the writing on the wall. The evidence was too clear, the pattern too obvious to deny. As the investigation entered its second week, the team made an important decision. They would not just document the problems, they would propose solutions. This included new training programs, better supervision protocols, and most importantly, a complete overhaul of how traffic stops were conducted and documented. The prosecutor's night in jail, though unjust, had become a catalyst for real change. His unique position, being both a victim of profiling and a federal prosecutor, created an opportunity that couldn't be ignored. Sometimes, he reflected, the most powerful cases are the ones that force everyone to see an old problem in a new light. 6 months after that fateful traffic stop, the city's police department looked very different. The changes weren't just in policies written on paper, you could see them in the daily interactions between officers and citizens, in the new faces at training sessions, and in the data that showed a steady decline in biased policing incidents. The federal prosecutor stood at a podium in the police academy's main hall, addressing a new class of recruits. Behind him, a screen displayed dashcam footage from his own arrest, now used as a teaching tool for what not to do. The room was silent as the future officers watched, many of them taking notes. "This isn't just about one traffic stop or one officer's mistake," he explained, his voice carrying through the hall. "It's about the choices we make every day. It's about looking at someone and seeing a person first, not a stereotype." In the back of the room sat Officer Peterson, no longer on patrol duty, but required to attend these training sessions as part of his disciplinary action. The investigation had led to his suspension, followed by mandatory retraining. He'd initially been defensive, but watching the evidence pile up had changed something in him. The department had implemented new requirements. Every traffic stop was now recorded from start to finish, without exception. Officers couldn't mute their microphones without documented reason. Most importantly, every claim of credentials had to be verified immediately, no matter how busy the officer might be. Community feedback sessions, once sparsely attended formalities, now drew crowds. People shared their experiences, good and bad, and police leadership was required to attend and respond. The walls between law enforcement and the community were slowly coming down, one conversation at a time. Last week, the prosecutor continued, "I got pulled over again." The recruits stirred uncomfortably, but he smiled. The officer was professional, respectful, and followed every new protocol perfectly. She verified my credentials immediately, explained why she'd stopped me, and sent me on my way with a warning about my taillight. That's how it should work. The changes reached beyond just traffic stops. The department had revamped its hiring practices, bringing in more diverse officers and leadership. Training now included extensive sessions on implicit bias, cultural awareness, and de-escalation techniques. Body cameras were checked regularly, and footage was reviewed not just for problems, but for examples of officers doing things right. The prosecutor's case had sparked similar reviews in other departments across the state. His civil rights team had created a template for investigating pattern or practice violations, one that was being adopted by other jurisdictions. What started as one wrong arrest was becoming a model for police reform. Back at the federal courthouse, things had changed too. The prosecutor's experience had given him a new perspective on the cases that crossed his desk. He looked more closely at police testimony, questioned assumptions more carefully, and worked harder to ensure that justice was truly blind. "The system only works when everyone in it follows the rules," he told the recruits. "When we take shortcuts, when we let bias guide our actions, we're not just failing the people we stop, we're failing ourselves and the principles we swore to uphold." In the months since the incident, over 50 cases had been reviewed and several convictions overturned due to similar profiling issues. Each one represented a life impacted by biased policing, a wrong that needed to be made right. The prosecutor's office had set up a special unit just to handle these reviews. The local media had followed the story closely, but what impressed the prosecutor most was how the department had embraced change instead of fighting it. The police chief, after initially resisting, had become a vocal advocate for reform. He often said that the incident had opened his eyes to problems he should have seen years ago. Officer Peterson's final disciplinary hearing had ended with an unexpected moment. He had asked to speak directly to the prosecutor, not to make excuses, but to apologize. "I saw what I expected to see," he admitted, "not what was actually there. I never thought about how many other times I might have done the same thing."